So I'm thinking maybe we can go through this basically straightforward without having to leave notes to edit things, and then I can just put in the intro and be done. Oh my God, speak of the devil, there it is.
Oh.
The intro music, yeah.
Got it.
Also, there are some groundskeepers working outside my apartment, and they might make some noise.
Yeah, and I usually have people drive quickly down my road, so.
So today we need to start by talking a little bit about politics. That is, the political systems of ancient Athens. Because before we understand what role Pericles played in Athens, you have to kind of understand what Athens was, right? So Athens is famous for being one of the first large-scale democratic political experiments. So as everyone knows, in Athens, the system that was used was what we might today call a direct democracy. The legislature was made up of the entire body politic. Every Athenian citizen had the ability to vote, or actually a mandate to vote, on every proposition in government.
Is this males and females?
No, males. Males only. Citizens. So citizens here.
Oh, citizens own land.
Yeah, property holding people who live in the city.
Yes.
But a legislative body as large as that can't get work done quickly. So even back in this day, it was known that there needed to be a separate executive. And in Athens, the executive was called the archon. There were actually... Well, it's a bit confusing. There were several constitutional reforms throughout the ages of Athenian history, and we're not going to go through that. By the classical period, there were 3 archons, and the one we care about was actually basically abolished just before Pericles came to power. Anyway, this office of archon, shortly before Pericles came to power, was given to... Rather than being an individual who is elected to that position, it was decided by lot. And so most of the responsibilities of that archonship were passed to a new office of military strategists. So the most important thing that an executive does is they lead the army, but the democratic movement in Athens kind of neutered this position, so it kind of got delegated to these non-elected strategist positions, or strategoi? Strategoi, I think that's how that's pronounced. And this was the office that Pericles held for most of his life. So Pericles was a Athenian statesman. I guess I should mention that we kind of wanted to do a main series episode on him, but it got a little... There wasn't that much to bite into in this life, so we're going to do him as a bonus instead. In part, inspired by the fact that he is the leader of Greece in Civ 6.
Yeah.
So anyway, Pericles kind of has, like Alexander, although he predates Alexander by a few decades, he kind of has this legendary status. That there's a funny legend surrounding his birth where his father dreamt that his mother had given birth to a lion. Just, yeah, it's a bit weird. And also almost guaranteed to be false. But that's how it goes with birth myths. Pericles grew up in the wake of the Persian Wars, as there began to be a kind of power imbalance or power struggle in the greater Greek world between the Athenian and Spartan city-states. Each of them was kind of collecting allies, and soon there was the Delian League, which was basically controlled by Athens, that reigned over most of mainland Greece, and the Peloponnesian League. I don't actually know if this other faction had a name, but it was basically controlled by Sparta and her allies. And a conflict was basically guaranteed from the beginning. Athens was under Pericles' influence in a large part, spreading her influence across the Mediterranean. So they were setting up colonies in Asia Minor, in the Dardanelles. Pericles led a fleet to Egypt to support a revolt there against the Persians. There was definitely a lot going on in the era before, in the mid-5th century BC. The final straw, to some degree, was when Pericles finally managed to convince the Assembly of Athens to ostracize his main political enemy, a guy named Cimon, or Simon. Okay, so, of course, having run upon this guy's name, I looked into it, and it turns out it's not directly related to the modern word Simon. That comes from Syriac, from, Simon the Apostle. So for that reason, a lot of people like to call this guy Cimon, even though his name looks like Simon. Anyway, linguistic tangent. So he was a populist in many regards. He stirred the people up and gave them the things that they asked for, basically, even if they weren't necessarily smart. So he lowered the property requirements for becoming an archon. He gave very, very high wages to people who served on juries. And he also kind of gave in to a sort of xenophobia that was existing among the Athenian people at a time, where he passed a law limiting Athenian citizenship to people who had Athenian parentage on both sides. So kind of restricting the voting body, giving his supporters, who happen to be the majority, more control. This is really kind of standard populism, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Most historians seem to think that the Peloponnesian War, where he really began to shine as a military strategist and tactician and a political leader, was mostly his fault. These tensions were already existing, but he made several unprovoked military excursions into Spartan territory that kind of triggered this 10-year-long conflict. 10-year long? Hang on. How long was the actual Peloponnesian War? Oh, I'm sorry. 30-year-long conflict.
Oh.
Yeah. The Persian king at the time, a guy named Archidamus II, there were two Spartan kings at each time, right? So the tensions were rising. A Spartan army was approaching the city of Corinth, which was kind of a midpoint between the Athenian and Spartan spheres of influence. It was on the isthmus between Attica and Peloponnesus, right? And Pericles interpreted this under Athenian law to be a hostile action. It probably wasn't, but it was a casus belli of a sort to prevent Spartan emissaries from entering the city of Athens anymore. And this was a terrible insult to the Spartans, and they just invaded Attica, which is the peninsula that Athens exists on. When they got there, there was nobody there. Pericles knew that the Spartan strategy would be to invade and just destroy the countryside, so he took everybody out of the countryside and forced them all to move into the city. A lot of the people in the country didn't really like this, and the people in the city didn't really like this, but it worked. And keeping this strategy of hiding inside Athens itself and maintaining control of the water is what enabled Athens to really last this whole 3 decades of war with Sparta. The Spartans, from the very beginning, had undeniable control of the land, but the Athenians had undeniable control of the sea. Actually, the same thing kind of happens later. We're going to talk about it with the Romans and Carthaginians in a main series episode. But that's a digression. At the end of the first year of the war, as the campaigning was winding down, the 100-ship fleet that he sent to raid the Peloponnesian shores had come back, and there was a Yes, so there was a ceremony towards the end of the year where Pericles, this is the moment that he's really, really famous for, Pericles gave his famous funeral oration. He was an excellent public speaker, and this oration is preserved in its entirety. You can go read it. It's quite good, and it's just a funeral for all of the soldiers who died for Athens. He talks about the greatness of Athens and the importance of their sacrifice. One notable line is that there's the people of Athens who are honoring the dead can't give them any more honor than they have given themselves in the act of dying for the city, which Abraham Lincoln totally stole for the Gettysburg Address. Mm-hmm. In fact, he was reading his copy of this speech the week before. So so that's the reason that he really gets remembered. So anyway, the following year, the Spartans once again attacked Attica, the region surrounding Athens, but Pericles didn't revise his original strategy. He kept everybody back in the city, and once again, he took 100 ships and went around to plunder the Peloponnesian coast, except this time personally. Interestingly, there was a solar eclipse. This happens all the time in the stories, right? There was a solar eclipse the day that this Athenian fleet set out. And this made the soldiers really, really scared because that's a bad omen. But Pericles happened to be friends with the philosopher Anaxagoras, who had figured out the cause of solar eclipses.
Ooh.
Yeah. So he was just like, no, guys, it's all right. It's just the moon. The moon is getting in front of the sun. Don't worry about it. And I guess the sailors were like, oh, that's fine. It's not such a bad thing anymore.
No, not at all.
However, shortly after he left the city, the Spartans kind of renewed their vicious attack in this siege that they've had going on basically for the whole year. And a plague broke out in the city that is suspected to have been caused on purpose by the Spartans. Mm-hmm. Pericles was recalled because the public apparently didn't know about the whole eclipse thing. They think that the plague is Pericles' fault. Oh. And he's brought to trial and told and he has to defend himself. He managed to kind of temper the people's resentment against him, but he still had a lot of political enemies, and they were quite determined to undermine him. And so they managed to deprive him of his generalship. They took away his public office and gave him a tremendously large fine. Nonetheless, over the course of the next year, he kind of got the will of the people back, and he got his generalship back. And the very same year, Yeah, and the very same year he came down with that plague that was ravaging Athens, and he didn't make it very far. So he only lived through the first 2 years of the Peloponnesian War, but he had a very significant impact on Athenian culture and Athenian history that he's worth mentioning at least. And so this is why we're doing this little 15-minute piece on him. Do you have anything to add?
Personally, no, I don't actually.
Okay, that's nice to me. Next week, we're going to talk about the first Romans. So we're leaving the Greeks behind for good. Or the first Romans for our podcast, not the first Romans.
Good clarification.
Yes. In the meantime, you can email us at thegreats2date@gmail.com. We are on... actually, we probably should get on some other social media. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/thegreats2date. And with that said, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you then. Okay, cool. I'll edit that and put it out.
We did it.